All down. All silent. Going. Go. So congratulations.
Welcome to the Current Market Insights podcast, brought to you by Harris Partners Real Estate. Each episode, we chat with real estate author and industry leader Peter O'Malley to discuss the current property market conditions and provide insights to assist you on your property journey.
Hello and welcome to another edition of Current Market Insights. I'm your host, Kieran O'Brien, and with me as always is my good friend, Mr. Peter O'Malley. Peter, hello.
Hi, Kieran. Great to see you.
Great to see you again, Peter. Let's jump straight in tonight. I would love to discuss and get your thoughts on a couple of media articles and news reports that have come out this week. The first one is a piece done on the ABC with Alan Kohler, the finance expert, who's got a great financial report, as I'm sure many of our listeners will know. But in that, Alan talks about how the government, all across the country, housing is a big issue. Yourself and I have spoken a lot about housing in terms of crisis, supply and demand, etc. But in this piece, Alan talks about how he believes that building is or needs to get dense. And it's something we have touched on, but I wanted to get your thoughts on, firstly, the piece and the concept from Alan in the first instance that Australia really is ready and needs to adopt this concept of higher density living.
Yeah, well, I think he did question whether people are prepared, particularly families, to live in apartments. It's a big change to what most of us grew up with, essentially forcing or certainly coercing the population into denser living, whether it be townhouses or apartments. And there will be issues out of that. And what is very unfortunate with the apartment sector and the strata title sector at the moment is so many buildings have issues coming out of that. And that is actually clashing with both state and federal governments' narratives and objectives, where they are trying to encourage people into a form of housing that has actually got escalating issues occurring in it. So New South Wales have got David Chandler, the building commissioner, who's trying to clean it up. But with respect to Mr. Chandler, who's got a massive job in front of him, he's well behind the curve in terms of cleaning up building defects because it's been allowed to run so far in that direction. So, look, from what I took with the Alan Kohler segment that you refer to, he was as much posing the question, are Australians ready for this? Because we seem much more at home with house and land packages in the burbs than we do. Now, this was the article, wasn't it, where he spoke about there's so much efficiency and productivity to be gained by building closer to infrastructure. It saves government budgets when you can build over the top of infrastructure rather than continuing to allow urban sprawl to spread. So governments have a clear incentive in terms of managing their budgets and the population by going for dense housing close to or over the top of critical infrastructure such as metro stations, train stations, etc. But is the public really ready for it?
Yeah, look, you're exactly right. It is the piece where he talks about how if the government wants to expedite this process and actually get housing into spaces where it's needed, then obviously building around infrastructure is the logical way to go. He does also make the point that the onus in the government's plan really is on councils to facilitate this and actually support local development and get, housing as a priority. But he also makes the point very clearly that if they don't, the government will step in and just say, boom, as they've done in Homebush, for example, and some places on the lower North Shore. And they just said, well, we're building here and that's it. I think you make an interesting...
On that point, if I can highlight that, I think where it gets really juicy is when a state Labor government overrule a Liberal council. Everyone can sort of live with that. That's the way of the world. But we're seeing this here in the inner west where you have a state Labor government trying to overrule a Labor council, and they've got differing objectives, and that's where it gets really spicy. And I don't think we've seen the last of that internal battle, if you like, between state governments and local councils over density levels.
Oh, not even close. I think it's, we only talked about this last week regarding zoning and dual occupancies and councils' restrictions and delays. The government are just making their own state level policies that they're quite happy to drive irrespective of what the council thinks. And I think gosh, there's so many pundits or fans of a two-tiered government in New South Wales that would be quite happy with this fight, to be fair. But I want to touch on something you mentioned, which is that David Chandler is behind the eight ball in terms of building quality and actually assessing some of these defects.
Through no fault of his own. It's just when he came to the job, of course. So should clarify, yeah.
Of course, but Alan does make the point in his piece that that's one of the big issues here with Australians' mentality around higher density living is not necessarily that the quality is or isn't as good. The apartment they're looking at may be great quality, but after things like the Opal Tower and after, the issues in Mascot, for example, people have that innate kind of belief now that any apartment built after 2010, for example, is incredibly shoddy. It's going to fall apart. It'll leak. It's got, and we hear this all the time at inspections, for example. The older dads that come out for their kids are like, you've got to get a red brick apartment from the 70s because there's nothing wrong with them. So I think
it's stood the test of time.
Of course they have. And, you can see the quality yourself. It's a very different era. But it certainly does make it very challenging for families to consider a shift to an apartment with shared facilities where, they have all these ongoing costs and there is the potential that they could get evicted at a moment's notice with zero compensation, which is concerning. He also does raise the other point that, Australians are so used to property as a vehicle for capital growth and as an investment tool that getting your head around the low or, almost absent capital growth in apartments, I'm not going to say completely because it's not a blanket rule, but the very low apartment capital growth and, in fact, in some cases losses when you compare with freestanding homes is a massive mental restriction here.
That's right. I think it was 6 times the amount of apartment owners sell at a loss in comparison to homeowners or house owners.
Correct.
And there was some suburbs named. Epping, I think, was the biggest drop for apartments.
Yeah, I think it was like
Sydney.
19.8% or something from the 2010 highs. Like quite a drop, but also quite a long time.
And we've got a number of clients at the moment who would be very, very happy to get their transaction costs back above their purchase price from 2013, 2014 in apartments where things have gone wrong, flammable cladding needs replacing, elevated strata, water ingress issues, etc. These are not all strata title buildings, but there are too many of them by the same token, and strata levies at $5,000 a quarter have an impact on how buyers assess the opportunity, no matter how nice the actual apartment itself is. That's a big expenditure at the moment.
Yeah, I must admit I do find it interesting, and it's obviously the way we've grown up here. I grew up in Sydney, very fortunate to have house and land, as you say. But I look at plenty of the other global cities I've been to, and high density, centralised, convenient living is such a staple that I feel like Australia, if we take the time, it's perhaps one generation's mindset change into a really functional, efficient city. And the way we're going in terms of immigration and population growth, we seriously need to consider something because there is nowhere else to build other than out. And, living out is convenient and cheaper and all those things, but, what do you do for work? What do you do? Schooling, all the other things that come with it. And I personally feel like we really do need to adjust our mindset and embrace this if we're going to accommodate the people that are coming.
Well, look, this is the state Labor government that did sort of, put a red pen through work from home a few months ago and ordered all of the public servants back to the office that had been working at home. So that is all about, office space being devalued globally, and that can have knock-on effects and contagion effects when you start having superannuation funds and massive corporates, having to write down high-rise towers in value on their books because essentially only half the workplace turn up to it. So there's a lot of vested interest behind all of this, and I'm not saying that's wrong. I'm just saying that's the reality of the world. Like if you think about the new, not so new now, the Barangaroo Towers, we didn't build those to sit empty.
Yeah.
And I remember during COVID, someone who worked for Facebook told me that Facebook had like 3 floors in one of those towers there, just completely empty, everyone working from home.
Yeah.
They're paying full rent on it.
Yeah, which is absurd.
And they could afford it, but there's many other businesses that, may not have been able to afford having such prime commercial office space sitting there completely empty for the entire COVID period. So it's very clear where they're trying to take Sydney, which is high density in and around the city, getting the productivity from the metro. And it's not to say that if the Liberal government were in power for another term that they wouldn't have had a similar mindset, because let's face it, with the magnificent world-class metro that we're all enjoying at the moment, they didn't build it to service the existing population, did they?
No, that's why it's not in places that I need it to be, Peter.
That's right. It's over-engineered for what's coming.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So moving on, the other piece that I really wanted to talk about, and we'll lead into our usual market wrap this week, I think. Channel 7 ran a piece where they interviewed Eliza Owen, who's the head of research for Corelogic.
Good article.
Yeah, great article. And, very, very clever lady. She's, knows the numbers, great researcher. But she makes the point that we have made quite a lot on this podcast, that the alarm bells are singing at the moment because the clearance rate is starting to fall. And you have to correct me if I'm wrong here, but I feel like they said it's to hit the lowest rate in a decade. I might have that timescale wrong, so I do apologise if it is off. But she talks about how the clearance rate's plummeting. I really want to get your thoughts on that piece in particular, given that we talk about the importance of the clearance rate week after week on the show.
Look, it wasn't the lowest clearance rate in a decade. It was the lowest clearance rate in 3 years since they started increasing interest rates, because the market did take a severe knock after the rate hikes of 2022, and that was a particularly challenging year. The most challenging year before 2022, when the rates started going up, was obviously the first 3 months of COVID, when people thought the sky was falling in, understandably. Clearance rates were really weak then. And then in 2018, during the self-imposed credit squeeze with the Banking Royal Commission, that was also a weak year for auction clearance rates. So it's really, really important to understand that the property market does not always go up, clearly, and there are periods there where growth is really strong. And when you see short, sharp bursts of growth, you'll always hear in the media about that one sale, as we heard last weekend about an apartment down at Balmoral that went for $1 million over expectations. But what Eliza Owen, who was taking a wider view of the market in her commentary on Saturday night, was highlighting is that the auction clearance rate is down, and that there are an increasing number of property owners, particularly apartment owners, who are being forced onto the market to sell during the current interest rate setting, and unfortunately they're going out at a loss. Now, if you buy a property for $800,000 and sell it for $680,000, make no mistake, that's not a $120,000 drop. You've got to put the $35,000 stamp duty on top. You'll probably pay a real estate agent $25,000 to sell it for you, and the interest costs and the strata repayments that we've just spoken about are all a wipeout.
Yeah.
So an $800,000 purchase that becomes a $680,000 sale, if that's the example we're using, that can turn out to be a $250,000 drop very, very easily.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it was a great article that Channel 7 ran on Saturday night, because as we've touched on here over the last month or so, there's pockets of weakness that are collapsing in Sydney. The mortgage belt, as they call it, is really falling apart as far as the property market goes, and no one seemed to be talking about it because they'll always chase that one sale in the eastern suburbs or Balmoral Beach that's gone well over expectations. And I saw another article on the weekend where apparently a car space in Sydney went up for sale for $525,000. Isn't Sydney real estate crazy? It's going wild. Well, depends what part of Sydney you're referring to.
Yeah, that car space was in North Bondi, by the way, where I think only a property in that same building set the record for an individual apartment sale in Sydney this year. So it's not, as you say, you can pick the winners or the articles that are going to generate traction. I really want to get from you though. We obviously talk about clearance rate and the importance that the important role that it plays, I guess, as a yardstick for how the market is performing. In some ways, as a mentality, what's the general feel of the market? What does the current what does this article and what does the current situation say in your mind if you are someone who is perhaps thinking, okay, well, look, now's the time for me to buy something and sell the one I'm in, to downsize, or now's an opportunity for me to make a trade. Is this current market setting actually a good time to do that? And are there risks with what's happening?
Look, a rising market's not all good and a falling market's not all bad. And I'm not sure if we're in either at the moment. Depends on what part of the city, what product category you're trading in. What I do know is if you overprice in a falling market, you're headed for disaster.
Yeah.
So we actually handed a listing back today to one of our clients who wouldn't follow our advice. And we said, look, no hard feelings, but we're not putting the property on the market at that price. And we encourage you to go and find an agent that is prepared to do that. But we openly and straight between the eyes are telling you now when we're not going to do that. We're not putting it on the market and running a campaign because we know how it ends. There's still real estate agents out there trying to buy listings, and they're hopeful that they're going to get lucky when they put that listing to market. Now, you can always get lucky as a real estate agent selling an overpriced property. You can always get lucky, and the chances of getting lucky increase when stock levels are low. At the moment, stock levels are not low. They're high and they're rising further. And anyone that comes to market pitched above where the market's at is going to really struggle. I've had people that I've pitched, priced at market price, and by the time they've come to the market's not quite where they want it to be, and they've had to reduce from market price to capture the new price level so they can sell before it slips any further. So you can imagine the catastrophe of someone that has been misled into coming to market well above expectations, and there's a lot of that happening at the moment. As we speculated on a few weeks ago when the agents were all rescheduling their auction campaigns, it's like they're kicking the can down the road. There's going to be carnage further down the track as all these unsold listings start competing with each other, and that's where we are now, where there's a lot of overhanging stock from the first month of spring about to compete with the next wave of spring stock after these school holidays are finished.
Yeah, as you say, exactly as we talked about and you certainly predicted would be the case. You mentioned there that the listing that you handed back, for example, was a case of price expectation not being where it should be, and you're rightly saying it's not going to work right now. That's obviously great advice for a seller in this market, is if you are priced right and you can openly, consider the circumstances and adjust accordingly, you'll potentially get a good sale. As a buyer at the moment, do you have any advice or any approach that a potential buyer should be taking to try and buy a good price listing at the moment? If it's potentially not going to go to a good competitive auction or there's not going to be a great amount of interest necessarily, how might a buyer go about actually closing out a purchase?
The first thing I'd say to a buyer about the market conditions is that if you've got a property to sell, it's all relevant. So that's why I say a rising market is not all good and a falling market's not all bad if that's what we're in or coming into, because if you've got to buy and sell, you've got to do one transaction to do the other.
Yeah.
But if you are, let's say for whatever reason you've already sold, or you are going to buy an investment property, or you're entering the market and you don't need to sell anything, what I'd say is that interest rates will go down next year and stock levels will subside next year. And at the moment, interest rates are at a setting that is clearly impacting the market, and stock levels are swelling. So I think for a buyer who's not trying to be greedy and grab a bargain, but just wants good real estate at a fair price, this period between now and Christmas could be quite opportune.
Okay. And I would assume that it's the same advice we usually give our buyers, which is, make sure your ducks are in a row, put an offer on a contract, have everything ready to go, make it easy for the seller, particularly in a market that is a bit uncertain, to just say, well, look, this is a great opportunity right now for us to exit.
Look, the seller's probably going to be in a bit of discomfort over the price.
Yep.
So to help overcome that, format your offer as a buyer in the most appealing fashion that you can.
Yeah.
So a high price on an email, the buyer might bite at that. But if you're not offering a high price, you need to package that in the most compelling fashion. It's not the price you want, but here's a signed contract. Here's a 5 or a 10% deposit. Here's a 66W waiving the cooling off rights. So I am a genuine buyer at the table. A vendor who really wants to sell or needs to sell is going to say to their agent, well, who else is interested and what are they offering? And if there's not a better paying buyer for that property in the marketplace and the vendor's desire to move on is high, you'll probably secure it. But it's very difficult to secure a piece of real estate with an email offer at a price that's unexciting to the vendor.
Yeah, even if it suits the buyer in terms of ease. With that in mind then, Peter, why don't we have a bit of a look at this week's data? So obviously for our listeners, throughout the week we look closely at Louis Christopher and SQM Research's numbers as we think he probably is the most accurate property analyst. But off the back of that article from Channel 7 and Corelogic, and obviously with Louis' numbers, what does the clearance rate look like from his perspective?
Well, in Melbourne, it was 48.4% for the week, and in Sydney it was 43% for the week. 43.
That's got to be the lowest we've reported on, surely.
For some time, yes.
Yeah,
that's right. The 43's, that's a 57% failure rate. So you can see here why we're saying is that it's been sub 50 now for about 7 or 8 weeks. So each week, 50% of the auction stock is just piling up. Some of it sells shortly after. A lot of it sells shortly after. But by the same token, in any suburb that I look in across the inner west, I start to see listings that are just sitting there and not moving as quickly as everybody would like. Of the properties that sold in Sydney, 191 sold prior and 156 sold under the hammer. So a comfortable win there to people selling by negotiation prior to auction rather than chancing their arm under the hammer. If we go to Melbourne, which of the capital cities is the only one that recorded a loss last month, on Corelogic's numbers, they had a higher clearance rate than Sydney. 183 of their sales were sold prior, but 408 were under the hammer.
Right, that's quite a big difference.
Yeah, it is, and that's in a falling market. So I don't know if the agents are handling the price issue differently or better in Melbourne as to why so many more properties would be selling under the hammer as opposed to selling prior to the auction compared with Sydney. But the growth for Sydney in September on Corelogic's numbers, I think, for house price growth was something like 0.03%. So it's a static market, clearly, where Melbourne had recorded an actual fall. So if you don't see the Sydney auction clearance rate jump up in the next few weeks, I think you will see negative readings at some stage between now and Christmas. That's where the trajectory is going.
And you're talking about obviously the house price there. So you're saying we'll see a loss in overall house price averages in Sydney if that rate keeps falling.
Yeah, that's right. And there'll be suburbs that are still rising.
Of course.
Don't get me wrong. So I'm not calling a crash, but we're right on the precipice where Sydney will start recording negative price performance for both houses and apartments.
Yeah, really interesting data, Peter. And I think, as you mentioned, the number sort of selling before and under the hammer in Sydney really does just underpin that data. It shows that it's accurate, that the pricing strategy is super important. The conversation with the agent and the seller and the buyer is really important. And if you don't have all that organised and you are just being opportunistic, you're very likely going to fail and end up kicking the can down the road, as you say.
Oh, that's right. And, if you go to market and you fail and it doesn't work out and you go, well, that's a bit of bad luck, isn't it? And you move on, that's fine. But nothing happens in isolation. If you run a full campaign and you've got there's a market price on your property of, say, 2.2 to 2.4, and you go with a real estate agent who says they can get you 2.8, you will probably spend somewhere in the order of $10,000 to run that campaign. You will create an unerasable digital footprint against the property's history, and then you'll go to auction and you'll fail, and that'll be stamped against the property's digital footprint for all time for everyone to see, and you'll be somewhere in the order of $10,000 out of pocket with a damaged product on your hands that you're trying to move on. And I saw a young couple last week where they met 4 or 5 agents who led them to believe their property was worth around 1.3. And they're on the market for their second auction campaign now with an auction guide of in the mid-9s.
Wow. Well, on that bombshell, Peter, I think a good opportunity to wrap up tonight. Some really interesting discussions and, really, really insightful commentary. I think the future of housing stability in Sydney is going to be a really interesting one, and we certainly need to keep an eye on the clearance rate as the weeks move forward. As always, Peter, look, thanks for coming in and thanks for having a chat with us on the podcast.
Thanks, Kieran.
And thanks to everyone for listening to Current Market Insights. We look forward to speaking with you next time.
Thanks for joining us on the Current Market Insights podcast, brought to you by Harris Partners Real Estate, the podcast providing real estate insights you won't find anywhere else.